The Poison in the Red Velvet Suit. Welcome to Velvet Clues, I'm Connor, and tonight I bring you a tale that will forever change how you look at Christmas parades. Before we begin, let me ask you, what's your earliest memory of seeing Santa Claus? Was it at a shopping mall, a local parade, or perhaps sneaking downstairs on Christmas Eve? Share your memories in the comments below. I find that our childhood associations with Santa make what happened in St. Mary Mead all the more chilling. Now, pour yourself some hot cocoa, perhaps add a splash of something stronger, and let me tell you about the day Santa Claus died in front of hundreds of witnesses. Chapter 1. Santa's Last Parade. The morning of December 15th dawned unseasonably warm for St. Mary Mead, with temperatures that had Mrs. Bantry remarking to anyone who would listen that it felt more like April than December. Miss Jane Marple, adjusting her best hat as she prepared to attend the annual Santa Claus parade, noted through her window that the unusual warmth had brought out crowds larger than typical for the village's premier Christmas event. The parade had grown considerably over the years, transforming from a simple procession of the church choir and a borrowed fire truck into an elaborate spectacle featuring 12 floats sponsored by local businesses, 3 marching bands from neighbouring schools, and enough tinsel and artificial snow to rival any London department store display. Miss Marple took her customary position outside the post office, where the slight elevation of the steps provided an excellent vantage point for observing both the parade and the assembled crowd. She noticed with interest that Marcus Webb, the wealthy businessman who had controversially volunteered to play Santa Claus this year, was already visible on the final float, an elaborate construction labelled Santa's North Pole Workshop that featured mechanical elves hammering at tiny workbenches and a snow machine that dusted the crowd with soap flakes meant to resemble falling snow. Webb had insisted on the honour of playing Santa, much to the disappointment of Colonel Bantry, who had performed the role for the previous decade. The parade began precisely at 2 o'clock with the town brass band playing God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, while local children dressed as angels walked before them strewing paper snowflakes. Float after float passed by. The butcher's shop had created a Victorian Christmas dinner scene, complete with an enormous papier-mâché goose, while the library's float featured characters from Dickens's A Christmas Carol, with the librarian's nephew making a rather convincing Ghost of Christmas Future. The warmth of the day was causing various costume mishaps. Miss Marple observed several snowmen removing their heads to fan themselves, and the chorus of elves on the bakery's gingerbread house float had rolled up their striped stockings. Marcus Webb, resplendent in his red velvet Santa suit, complete with authentic-looking white beard and wire-rimmed spectacles, waved enthusiastically from his throne atop the North Pole Workshop. Miss Marple noticed he was perspiring heavily, drops of sweat visible on his forehead despite the white wig and false eyebrows. The heavy velvet suit, designed for December's typical chill, must have been insufferably warm in the unexpected heat. Dorothy Fletcher, the parade organiser, walked alongside the float with a clipboard, occasionally calling up instructions to Webb about when to throw candy canes to the children. As the parade reached the village green, where the official Christmas tree stood waiting to be lit in the ceremony that would conclude the festivities, something changed in Webb's demeanour. His enthusiastic waving became mechanical, then ceased entirely. His gloved hand moved to his chest, clutching at the red velvet as his face contorted in apparent pain. For a moment, the crowd thought it might be part of the performance, perhaps Santa clutching his heart at the joy of seeing so many good children. Then Webb toppled sideways from his throne, crashing into the mechanical workshop and sending tiny wooden toys scattering across the float's platform. The parade ground to an immediate halt. Dr. Haydock, who had been watching from outside his surgery, pushed through the crowd and clambered onto the still-moving float. Miss Marple observed him checking Webb's pulse, attempting chest compressions, but his grim expression told the story before he officially pronounced it. Marcus Webb, dressed as Santa Claus, was dead. The children in the crowd began crying, not understanding why Santa wasn't getting up, while their parents tried to shield them from the sight. The mayor hurriedly announced that Santa had simply fainted from the heat and would be fine after some rest, ushering families away from the scene. But Miss Marple remained, watching as Inspector Slack's police car arrived and noting with interest that Dr. Haydock seemed puzzled by something about Webb's condition, repeatedly examining the dead man's neck and arms as if searching for something that should be there but wasn't. Chapter 2. The Velvet That Killed. By evening, the village hall had been transformed from parade headquarters into a makeshift investigation centre, with Inspector Slack commandeering the main room where the various parade floats had been stored before the event. Miss Marple, who had managed to position herself as an elderly witness who might need to sit down, observed the proceedings from a chair near the door, her keen eyes missing nothing as the inspector began what promised to be a complex investigation. The Santa costume, that festive red velvet suit that should have brought joy to children, had been carefully removed from Webb's body and laid out on a table like evidence of something far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination had yielded puzzling results. Webb had died from acute cardiac arrest, his heart simply stopping mid-parade. But the symptoms suggested something beyond natural causes. His pupils had been contracted to pinpoints, his skin had shown unusual flushing, and most tellingly, there had been a distinctive sweet smell on his breath that the doctor recognised but couldn't immediately place. When Inspector Slack had suggested a heart attack, brought on by the heat and the weight of the costume, Haydock had shaken his head firmly. This was no natural death, though the exact cause remained frustratingly unclear. Dorothy Fletcher sat in a folding chair, her parade organiser's clipboard still clutched in her trembling hands. She had been responsible for obtaining the Santa costume, having rented it from Theatrical Traditions, a well-regarded costume company in London that supplied theatres and film productions. The costume had arrived by delivery van 3 days before the parade, and Fletcher had personally signed for it, storing it in the locked costume room of the village hall where all the parade regalia was kept. Only she had the key, though she admitted she had allowed several people supervised access to prepare for their roles in the parade. Thomas Reed, the master craftsman who had designed and built the North Pole Workshop float, confirmed he had been in the costume room multiple times. He needed to check the measurements of the Santa throne against Webb's proportions while wearing the suit. Reed was a quiet man in his 50s, whose skilled hands had created most of the village's parade floats over the years. His workspace behind the hall was filled with paint, tools, and various chemicals used in his craft. Miss Marple noticed his fingers were stained with what appeared to be wood stain, and there was a faint chemical odour about his clothing that spoke of someone who worked regularly with solvents and treatments. Catherine Webb arrived at the hall demanding to see her husband's body, her perfect composure cracking only slightly when told it had been taken for post-mortem examination. She confirmed that Marcus had tried on the Santa suit 2 days before the parade, with her assistance to ensure it fit properly. He had complained it was rather heavy and warm even then, but had been determined to wear it, seeing his role as Santa as a chance to improve his public image in the village. She mentioned that the suit had a strange texture, slightly stiff as if it had been heavily starched, but they had assumed this was simply due to age or the rental company's cleaning process. Harold Price, who served as parade marshal and had overseen the logistics of the event, had also had access to the costume room. His job required checking all costumes and props to ensure they met safety standards. No sharp edges that might hurt children, no loose parts that could become projectiles. He remembered examining the Santa suit briefly, noting its good condition and authentic appearance. Price was a methodical man who had made detailed notes about every aspect of the parade, though Miss Marple observed that his notebook showed signs of recent pages being torn out. Sarah Mills, the young photographer hired to document the parade preparations for the village newsletter, had been in and out of the costume room repeatedly. She had photographed Webb in the Santa suit during his fitting, wanting before and after shots for her planned article about the parade's behind-the-scenes preparation. Her camera bag, still slung over her shoulder, contained rolls of film that would need to be developed, potentially providing a photographic record of everyone who had been near the costume. When Scotland Yard's chemical analysis team arrived that evening, their preliminary tests on the Santa suit revealed something extraordinary. The red velvet had been systematically treated with a solution of DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide, mixed with concentrated digoxin. DMSO was a powerful carrier agent that could transport substances directly through the skin, while digoxin was a heart medication that, in massive doses, would cause exactly the kind of cardiac arrest that had killed Webb. The heat of the day and Webb's perspiration had activated the absorbed chemicals, turning the Santa suit into a slowly acting poison delivery system. Someone had transformed a symbol of Christmas joy into a garment of death, and they had done it with scientific precision that suggested careful planning and access to very specific materials. Chapter 3. 5 Suspects Under Tinsel. The second day of the investigation brought revelations that transformed the murder from a shocking tragedy into something far more complex. Inspector Slack had established that the DMSO digoxin solution would have required careful preparation and application, likely taking several hours to treat the entire Santa suit properly. The killer would have needed privacy, knowledge of chemistry, and access to both substances in significant quantities. As Miss Marple sat in the village hall, ostensibly knitting while various suspects were interviewed, she observed that each of the 5 people with access to the costume had more connection to Marcus Webb than initially appeared. Dorothy Fletcher's composed exterior cracked when Inspector Slack presented her with bankruptcy documents from 5 years previous. Her family's textile business, Fletcher & Sons, had been destroyed when their largest client list was mysteriously acquired by Webb's competing firm. Webb had systematically undercut their prices, stealing clients with promises he never intended to keep, until the Fletcher business collapsed entirely. Dorothy's father had died of a stroke during the bankruptcy proceedings, and her brother now worked as a janitor in the very building Webb's company occupied. She admitted her hatred for Webb, but insisted she would never have risked ruining the parade that meant so much to the village children. Thomas Reed's connection to Webb went back even further. 20 years ago, Reed's father had been Webb's business partner in a construction venture. When the project failed due to substandard materials, Webb had produced documents suggesting his partner had ordered the inferior supplies without his knowledge. Reed's father had gone to prison for fraud, while Webb had emerged not only unscathed, but having somehow acquired his partner's share of their other investments. The elder Reed had died in prison 3 years into a 7-year sentence. Thomas had been 25 then, watching his family name destroyed, while Webb built his fortune on the ruins of their reputation. Catherine Webb's revelations proved the most shocking. Private investigators she had hired 6 months ago had uncovered that Marcus maintained another complete family in Thornfield, just 30 miles away. He had married another woman there 15 years ago, had 2 children with her, and visited them regularly under the pretense of business trips. This bigamy meant Catherine's own marriage was invalid, her financial security questionable, and her entire adult life built on a lie. She had been consulting divorce lawyers, only to discover that as she was not legally married, she had no claim to Webb's considerable fortune unless she could prove common law partnership, a complex legal battle that would take years. Harold Price initially seemed to have no connection to Webb beyond parade organization until Inspector Slack uncovered a tragedy from 8 years past. Price's younger brother, an accountant, had been accused of embezzlement from a charity fund he managed. The accusation had come from Marcus Webb, who served on the charity's board and claimed to have discovered discrepancies. Despite lack of concrete evidence, Webb's testimony had been damning. Price's brother, unable to bear the shame of the investigation and the destruction of his reputation, had taken his own life before the trial. The charges were later quietly dropped when no evidence materialized, but by then it was too late. Sarah Mills's story emerged when Inspector Slack found her engagement announcement from 2 years previous to Webb's own son, David. The engagement had been broken off suddenly after Marcus Webb convinced his son that Mills, a struggling photographer from a working-class background, was only interested in the family money. He had hired investigators to dig into her past, twisted innocent situations into suspicious circumstances, and gradually poisoned his son's mind against her. David had ended the engagement via a letter that Sarah still carried, his words clearly echoing his father's prejudices. She had moved to St. Mary Mead to escape the memories, only to find Webb had volunteered to play Santa in her first major photography assignment. Each suspect had access to the costume room, each had devastating motive to want Webb dead, and each had the intelligence and determination to plan such an elaborate murder. But as Miss Marple observed to her friend Mrs. Bantry over tea that evening, the question wasn't just who had motive and opportunity, but who had access to the specific chemicals needed. Digoxin was a prescription medication, carefully controlled, while DMSO, though used in veterinary medicine, wasn't something one could simply purchase at the chemist's shop. The killer had needed both substances in considerable quantities, suggesting either long-term planning to accumulate supplies or legitimate access to them. The investigation was narrowing, focusing not just on who hated Marcus Webb, that list was proving extensive, but on who could have acquired the tools for this particular method of murder. Chapter 4. Chemicals in the Workshop. The third morning of the investigation brought Inspector Slack to Thomas Reed's workshop, a converted barn behind the village hall where he created his elaborate parade floats and conducted his carpentry business. Miss Marple accompanied the inspector, having suggested that understanding the float building process might illuminate how someone could have gained extended private access to the Santa costume. The workshop was a cavern of creativity and chaos, with half-finished angel wings hanging from rafters, mechanical elves in various stages of assembly, and the distinctive smell of paint, varnish, and various chemical treatments filling the air. Reed met them at the door, his hands stained with wood stain as usual, seemingly unsurprised by their arrival. He led them through his workspace, explaining the various processes involved in float construction: the framework building, the papier-mâché molding, the painting and sealing, the mechanical elements that brought the displays to life. Miss Marple noticed several industrial-sized containers along one wall, labelled with chemical names that meant little to her, but clearly interested Inspector Slack. Reed explained these were various solvents, sealants and treatments necessary for weatherproofing the floats and ensuring the mechanical elements move smoothly despite December weather. On a workbench near the window sat an elderly woman's pillbox, the kind with compartments for each day of the week. Reed explained his mother lived with him since his father's death, and she often forgot her medications if he didn't set them out for her. She had a heart condition, he admitted when pressed, and took several medications including digoxin. The pillbox was nearly empty, suggesting either his mother had been taking her medication regularly, or, as Inspector Slack immediately suspected, the pills had been used for another purpose entirely. Reed insisted his mother never missed her doses, that he was careful about her health, but he couldn't explain why her prescription had been refilled twice in the past month, when once should have sufficed. The real revelation came when Inspector Slack noticed a locked cabinet marked with chemical hazard symbols. Reed explained this contained various substances used in restoration work. He also restored antique furniture, which required specific chemicals to treat wood rot, remove old finishes, and preserve delicate materials. When Slack insisted on seeing inside, Reed reluctantly produced a key. Among the bottles and containers was a large veterinary bottle of DMSO, nearly empty. Reed quickly explained he kept horses in the adjoining field and used DMSO for their joint problems, a common treatment any horse owner would recognize. The bottle was legitimately purchased from a veterinary supplier, with his name on the prescription label. Miss Marple noticed something else in the cabinet, a mortar and pestle, the kind used to grind substances into powder. There were traces of white residue in the bowl, and when Inspector Slack had it tested with a field kit, it reacted consistent with digoxin. Reed's explanation that he sometimes crushed his mother's pills to mix with her food when she refused to take them seemed reasonable, except for the quantity of residue present. This was more than crushing a pill or two. This suggested systematic grinding of many tablets into fine powder, the kind of powder that could be dissolved in a solution. Further investigation of the workshop revealed more damning evidence. In a drawer of Reed's desk, beneath invoices and design sketches, were detailed notes about absorption rates, skin permeability, and the interaction between DMSO and various medications. Reed claimed these were research for a historical novel he was writing about a Renaissance poisoner, but the modern chemical formulas and specific focus on transdermal absorption suggested a more contemporary application. There were calculations about body weight, perspiration rates, and the time needed for various doses to take effect, all consistent with planning a murder using the treated Santa suit. The most incriminating discovery came when Inspector Slack examined Reed's appointment diary. The costume had been delivered on December 12th, and the parade was on the 15th. On the nights of the 12th and 13th, Reed's diary showed he was working late on parade preparations, with no specific details. The workshop had its own key to the village hall's back entrance, used when moving large float pieces, which would have given Reed unlimited access to the costume room during hours when the building was empty. Security footage from a nearby shop showed lights in the village hall on both nights, though the angle didn't show who was inside. When confronted with the accumulating evidence, Reed remained calm, but Miss Marple noticed his hands had begun to tremble slightly. He admitted to hating Webb, to wanting justice for his father, but insisted that many people had similar feelings. When Slack pointed out that not many people had access to both digoxin and DMSO, Reed's composed facade began to crack. He suggested perhaps someone had stolen the chemicals from his workshop. After all, it was often left unlocked during the day when he was working. But the systematic nature of the poisoning, the careful calculation involved, the specific knowledge required, all pointed to someone with more than passing familiarity with these substances. The workshop that had created so much joy for village children over the years had also, it seemed, been the laboratory where Santa's lethal suit had been prepared. Chapter 5: A Father's Prison Death. Inspector Slack's investigation into the Reed family tragedy of 20 years past revealed a story that cast Marcus Webb's murder in a different light. Miss Marple, through her network of village connections and old friends, helped piece together the narrative from court records, newspaper archives, and the long memories of St. Mary Mead's older residents. The story that emerged was one of calculated betrayal that had destroyed not just a business partnership, but an entire family, leaving wounds that had festered for 2 decades before finally erupting in murder. James Reed, Thomas's father, had been a respected builder and contractor who had partnered with the young, ambitious Marcus Webb on a project to construct affordable housing in the county. Webb had handled the finances while Reed managed construction, a division that seemed logical given their respective expertise. The project had promised good profits while serving the community's need for quality homes. But when several houses showed foundation cracks within months of completion, investigation revealed substandard concrete had been used, a cost-cutting measure that saved thousands of pounds but compromised structural integrity. The paper trail Webb produced during the investigation was damning. Purchase orders bearing James Reed's signature showed he had ordered the inferior materials despite Webb's alleged protests. Email correspondence, later suggested to be forgeries but never proven as such, showed Reed dismissing Webb's concerns about quality. Bank records revealed deposits into Reed's personal account, matching the amount saved by using cheaper materials, though Reed insisted these were legitimate payments for other work. Webb testified with apparent reluctance, playing the role of a betrayed partner, forced to speak against a friend, his performance convincing judge and jury that he was another victim of Reed's greed. What the investigation had missed, or been led to miss, was Webb's relationship with the supplier of the substandard concrete. The company was owned by Webb's brother-in-law, though this connection was hidden behind shell companies and maiden names. The deposits to Reed's account had come from accounts Webb controlled, disguised as payments from other clients. The email evidence had been created using Reed's legitimate email address, but from IP addresses that, if anyone had checked, would have traced back to Webb's office. But Webb had hired the forensic accountant who investigated the case, had recommended the prosecutor, had essentially orchestrated the entire investigation to reach his predetermined conclusion. Thomas Reed had been 25 when his father was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He had sat through every day of the trial, watching Webb perform his reluctant witness act, seeing the jury's sympathy shift from his father to the seemingly honest partner who had been deceived. He had tried to support his mother, whose health declined rapidly under the strain. He had used his savings to pay for appeals that went nowhere, investigators who found trails that had been carefully covered, lawyers who eventually admitted the case was unwinnable. He had visited his father every week in prison, watching him age years in months, seeing his spirit break as he realized he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. James Reed had died of a heart attack in his cell 3 years into his sentence. The prison report noted he had been under considerable stress, had lost weight, hadn't been sleeping. What it didn't note was that he died on his son's birthday, or that his last letter to Thomas had contained an apology for failing to protect his family from Webb's machinations. Thomas had found his father's body himself, having arrived for his weekly visit to be told there had been an incident. He had held his father's cold hand while prison officials explained about the heart attack, all the while knowing that Webb had killed him as surely as if he had stopped his heart with his own hands. After the funeral, attended by only family and a few loyal friends who still believed in James Reed's innocence, Thomas had thrown himself into his work. He had taken over his father's workshop, transformed it into a space for creating parade floats and restoring furniture, activities that brought joy to others, while allowing him to lose himself in physical labor. His mother had never recovered from the ordeal, developing the heart condition that now required daily digoxin, a bitter irony that the medication keeping her alive was the same substance Thomas had used to kill Webb. For 20 years, Thomas had lived with the knowledge of Webb's guilt and his father's innocence. He had watched Webb prosper, had seen him at village events playing the successful businessman, had endured his condescending greetings when their paths crossed. When Webb volunteered to play Santa in the parade, the symbolism had been too much. The man who had destroyed his father dressing as a figure of generosity and joy. Thomas had begun planning that very day, researching methods, accumulating supplies, preparing for a murder that would be as carefully orchestrated as the frame-up that had destroyed his father. The red velvet Santa suit would become Webb's shroud, and his vanity in wanting to play Santa would be the pride that came before his very public fall. Chapter 6. The Bigamous Life Revealed. Catherine Webb sat in the morning room of her house, or rather, the house she had thought was hers until, discovering her entire marriage was a legal fiction. Inspector Slack and Miss Marple had come to interview her again, this time with documentation that revealed the full extent of Marcus Webb's deception. The other Mrs. Webb, as Catherine had bitterly come to think of her, was named Patricia Thornfield Webb, and she lived just 30 miles away in a house nearly identical to Catherine's, raising 2 children who bore a striking resemblance to the man both women had thought was their husband. The discovery had come through a private investigator Catherine had hired 6 months ago, when Marcus's business trips had become suspiciously regular. Every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes weekends, always with vague explanations about client meetings or site inspections, the investigator had followed Marcus to Thornfield, photographed him entering a suburban house with a key, embracing a woman at the door, playing with children in the garden. Further investigation revealed a marriage certificate dated 15 years ago, 2 years after his marriage to Catherine, making Patricia the legal wife and Catherine merely a woman who had been deceived for 17 years. Catherine produced a folder of evidence she had compiled, photographs, documents, credit card statements showing 2 sets of household expenses, 2 sets of birthday presents for children, 2 Christmas celebrations carefully scheduled to never overlap. Marcus had maintained complete double lives, with separate social circles, separate business contacts, even separate golf club memberships. The level of deception required was staggering, a testament to his organizational skills and complete lack of conscience. He had even listed different religions on different forms to explain why he could never attend church with either family. The financial implications were devastating. As Catherine was not legally married to Marcus, she had no automatic claim to his estate. The house was in his name alone, as were the investments, the business holdings, everything except a small savings account Catherine had maintained from before their supposed marriage. Her lawyers had told her she might claim palimony or establish a common law partnership, but such cases were difficult and expensive, taking years to resolve. Meanwhile, Patricia Webb, as the legal wife, would inherit everything unless Catherine could prove her claim in court. Miss Marple observed Catherine's controlled fury as she discussed her situation. This was not a woman destroyed by betrayal, but one transformed by it into something harder and more determined. She had already begun documenting every contribution she had made to Webb's success, the dinner parties she had hosted for his clients, the connections she had facilitated through her own social network, the unpaid work she had done for his business. She intended to fight for what she saw as rightfully hers, even if it took the rest of her life. When Inspector Slack asked about the Santa costume, Catherine admitted. She had helped Marcus try it on 2 days before the parade. She had noticed the strange stiffness of the fabric, had even mentioned it smelled odd, a chemical smell she couldn't identify. Marcus had dismissed her concerns, too pleased with how impressive he looked as Santa to care about such details. She had handled the costume extensively, helping him with the buttons, adjusting the belt, even steaming some wrinkles from the velvet. If it had been poisoned then, she would have been exposed as well, though she admitted she had worn gloves due to an eczema flare-up on her hands. The interview revealed Catherine had knowledge of chemistry from her university days. She had studied pharmacy before leaving to marry Marcus. She would have understood how DMSO worked, how it could carry substances through skin, how digoxin affected the heart. She even admitted to having old textbooks that covered such topics, though she claimed she hadn't opened them in years. When Slack pointed out this gave her both knowledge and motive, Catherine had laughed bitterly. "If I wanted to kill Marcus, Inspector, I would have done it in private, not in front of the entire village where his death would be investigated and his bigamy revealed. His public humiliation was worth more to me alive than his death could ever be." Yet Miss Marple noticed something Catherine hadn't mentioned, a greenhouse attached to the house where she grew exotic plants, including several species of foxglove, the natural source of digoxin. When asked about it, Catherine explained she grew them for their beauty, unaware initially of their toxic properties. But the books on her greenhouse shelf told a different story, including titles on medicinal and poisonous plants, with bookmarks in relevant sections. Catherine claimed these were for identifying harmful plants to keep them away from visiting children, but her expertise seemed deeper than casual safety concern. Chapter 7. The Brother's Suicide Note. Harold Price kept his brother Jeremy's suicide note in a safety deposit box at the bank, bringing it out only when Inspector Slack officially requested it as part of the murder investigation. The note, written 8 years ago in Jeremy's precise accountant's handwriting, revealed the complete destruction of a man who had been systematically destroyed by false accusations he could neither prove nor disprove. Miss Marple read it with the careful attention she gave to all documents that revealed human tragedy, noting how even in his final moments Jeremy Price had been trying to explain, to justify, to make someone understand that he was innocent. Jeremy had been the treasurer of the St. Mary Mead Children's Charity, a position he had held with pride for 5 years before Marcus Webb joined the board. The charity ran summer programs for underprivileged children, and Jeremy had managed its finances meticulously, ensuring every penny was accounted for and spent appropriately. But Webb had claimed to discover discrepancies, small amounts at first, then larger ones, money supposedly redirected to accounts that didn't exist for services never rendered. When Jeremy couldn't explain transactions he hadn't made, Webb had pushed for a full audit. The audit had been a nightmare. Transactions Jeremy had never authorized appeared in records, his electronic signature on documents he had never seen. Someone had been careful and clever, making it appear that Jeremy had been siphoning money over months, small enough amounts to avoid immediate detection, but adding up to nearly £30,000. The evidence was electronic, harder to dispute than paper, and Jeremy's protest that someone had accessed his computer credentials fell on deaf ears. Webb had played the reluctant accuser perfectly, expressing shock and sadness that someone he had trusted could betray children in need. Harold had fought for his brother, hiring computer forensics experts who found evidence of system intrusions but couldn't prove who had done them. The IP addresses traced to public Wi-Fi locations. The timeline suggested someone with inside knowledge but not necessarily Jeremy. But Webb had been persuasive, his reputation sterling, his concern for the charity apparently genuine. The board had voted to pursue criminal charges based on Webb's recommendation, and Jeremy had been suspended pending investigation. The shame had been immediate and overwhelming. The local newspaper had run the story on the front page with Jeremy's photograph under the headline, "Charity Treasurer Suspected of Theft." The suicide had happened 2 weeks after the suspension, before the criminal trial could begin. Jeremy had taken an overdose of sleeping pills, carefully calculated to be fatal, timed so he would be found by Harold rather than strangers. His note explained that he couldn't face a trial where he would be presumed guilty, couldn't subject his family to months or years of public humiliation, couldn't live with people believing he had stolen from children. He maintained his innocence to the end, but said innocence didn't matter when everyone already believed in guilt. After Jeremy's death, the charges had been quietly dropped. The charity had discovered the missing money had been a series of accounting errors and miscategorized transactions, easily explained once someone looked properly. But Webb had ensured no one looked properly while Jeremy was alive, had pushed for quick action, immediate suspension, public accountability. Harold had always suspected Webb had orchestrated the entire thing, though he could never prove it. Years later, he had learned Webb had wanted Jeremy's position for his own associate, someone who would be more flexible with the charity's investment strategies. Harold admitted to Inspector Slack that he had dreamed of killing Webb countless times. He had imagined strangling him, shooting him, pushing him from a height. But he had also imagined destroying Webb's reputation the way Webb had destroyed Jeremy's, revealing his crimes, his bigamy, his frauds. When Webb had volunteered to play Santa, Harold had seen an opportunity for poetic justice, the man who had destroyed innocence dying while dressed as a symbol of childhood joy. He had access to the costume, knowledge of the parade route, and through his work in parish administration, access to medications from elderly parishioners who often asked him to collect their prescriptions. But Harold also had an alibi for the nights the costume was treated. He had been at a parish council meeting on December 12th until nearly midnight, with 12 witnesses, and had spent December 13th at his sister's house in London, helping prepare for her daughter's birthday party. Train tickets, credit card records, and multiple witnesses confirmed his whereabouts, unless he had an accomplice, or had treated the costume during the brief windows when he accessed it for parade planning. He couldn't have been the poisoner. Chapter 8. Love Destroyed by Lies. Sarah Mills developed her photographs in the makeshift darkroom she had created in her cottage bathroom, watching faces emerge from chemical baths like ghosts materializing from the past. She had photographed the entire parade preparation, including several images of Marcus Webb trying on the Santa costume, and Inspector Slack wanted every image examined for potential evidence. Miss Marple sat in Sarah's small living room, observing how the young woman's hands shook slightly as she handled the photographs, whether from nerves or suppressed emotion remained unclear. The story of Sarah's engagement to David Webb emerged through the photographs she couldn't bring herself to destroy. Images of a happy couple at university graduation, on holiday in Cornwall, at the engagement party where Marcus Webb stood smiling beside his son, already planning the destruction of their relationship. David had been different from his father, gentle, artistic, uninterested in business beyond what would provide a comfortable life. He had loved Sarah's photography, encouraged her art, spoken of opening a gallery together where her work could be displayed. They had planned a small wedding, a modest life, children who would be raised with values different from Marcus Webb's ruthless ambition. The destruction had been systematic. Marcus had hired a private investigator to research Sarah's background, finding her father had been briefly imprisoned for drunk driving when she was 5, that her mother had worked as a cleaner, that Sarah herself had worked multiple jobs to pay for university. These facts, innocent in themselves, were twisted into evidence of gold digging. The investigator had photographed Sarah with male classmates from her photography course, creating implications where none existed. Marcus had presented this evidence to David gradually, poisoning each achievement Sarah earned with suggestions of ulterior motives. Sarah showed Miss Marple the letter David had written ending their engagement, his handwriting shaky, the words clearly struggled over. He accused her of things she had never done, referenced conversations she had never had, cited evidence that had been manufactured or misinterpreted. The worst part was the phrase, clearly coached by his father, "I cannot marry someone whose values are so fundamentally different from my family's values." Sarah had wanted to fight, to prove her innocence, but David had refused to see her, had returned her letters unopened, had blocked her calls. Within 6 months he had married someone his father approved of, a banker's daughter with the right connections. Moving to St. Mary Mead had been Sarah's attempt to start over, to build a photography business far from the memories of what she had lost. When she had learned Marcus Webb lived in the village, she had nearly left again, but refused to be driven away twice. She had avoided him successfully until he had volunteered to play Santa in the parade she was hired to photograph. The bitter irony of capturing his image in a costume representing generosity and joy had been almost unbearable. She admitted to crying after photographing him in the Santa suit, the man who had destroyed her happiness dressed as happiness itself. The photographs from the costume fitting were revealing. In one image, Thomas Reed could be seen in the background, handling something near the costume rack. In another, Dorothy Fletcher appeared to be examining the Santa suit's hem while Webb was distracted. Catherine Webb's gloved hands were visible adjusting the belt, her face turned away from the camera. Harold Price stood near a table with what looked like spray bottles, though the image was too blurry to be certain. Each suspect had been near the costume, had opportunities Sarah's camera hadn't fully captured, moments between shots when anything could have happened. Sarah admitted she had thought about destroying the photographs, about claiming the film had been damaged. But her professional integrity had won out. She had documented what she was hired to document, even if it meant preserving the image of a man she hated. When Inspector Slack asked if she had wanted Webb dead, She was quiet for a long moment before answering. I wanted him to suffer the way he made others suffer. Death seems too quick, too easy for someone who destroyed so many lives over decades. If I had killed him, Inspector, I would have found a way to make it last longer than a parade. But Sarah also revealed something unexpected. She had seen someone entering the village hall on the night of December 13th. She had been returning from photographing a barn owl, a nocturnal shoot that required late hours, when she saw a figure using a key to enter through the back door. The person had been carrying what looked like bottles or containers, though the darkness made identification impossible. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was parade preparation, but now wondered if she had witnessed the killer treating the Santa suit. Chapter 9. Confession in the Workshop. The confrontation came on the fourth morning of the investigation, when Inspector Slack arrived at Thomas Reed's workshop with a warrant and a team of forensic specialists. Miss Marple accompanied them, having suggested that the killer's emotional state might be fragile after days of investigation, ready to break if presented with the accumulated evidence. The workshop was unchanged, except for a half-finished angel wing that Reed had been painting, its white feathers still wet with paint that would never dry properly, because the artist's hand had begun to shake too badly to complete the work. Reed didn't seem surprised to see them. He stood beside his workbench, the same stained fingers, the same chemical smell surrounding him. But something in his posture had changed. The weight of 20 years of planning and 4 days of investigation had worn him down like water-eroding stone. When Inspector Slack began listing the evidence, the digoxin ground in the mortar and pestle, the DMSO from his veterinary supplies, the notes about absorption rates, the access to the village hall, Reed simply nodded, as if checking items off a list he had memorized long ago. "You ground up your mother's digoxin tablets," Inspector Slack stated, rather than asked. Reed nodded again, finally speaking in a voice rough with exhaustion. 60 tablets over 2 weeks. I told Mother the pharmacy had made an error, gave her replacement pills I bought from another source. She never knew her medication was being used for something else. He showed them the grinding process, demonstrating with aspirin how he had reduced the tablets to finest powder, mixed it with DMSO in precise proportions, created a solution that would penetrate fabric and remain stable until activated by heat and moisture. The treatment of the Santa suit had taken 2 nights. Reed described entering the village hall through the back door, using his key from float building work. He had worn protective gear, rubber gloves, a respirator, coveralls that he later burned. The first night he had applied the solution to the jacket, working systematically to ensure every inch of red velvet was saturated. The DMSO had carried the digoxin deep into the fabric's fibers, where it would remain dormant until body heat and perspiration activated it. The second night, he had treated the trousers, the hat, even the white trim, though he knew the fur wouldn't absorb as well as the velvet. He had calculated everything: Webb's weight, his likely perspiration rate given the costume's warmth, the parade's duration, the cumulative dose that would be absorbed over an hour of wear. He had tested the treatment on fabric scraps, timing how long it took for the DMSO to penetrate pigskin from the butcher's shop, adjusting concentrations until he achieved the desired absorption rate. The warm weather had been unexpected, but welcome, ensuring Webb would perspire heavily and absorb the maximum dose. Reed had watched from his float building station as Webb had climbed onto the Santa float, knowing that every minute in the costume brought him closer to death. Miss Marple asked the question that Inspector Slack had overlooked. Why the public nature of it? Why not poison him privately, where you might have escaped detection? Reed's composed facade finally cracked completely. Because he destroyed my father publicly. The trial, the newspaper headlines, the shame that followed our family everywhere. I wanted Webb to die in front of everyone, wearing a costume that represented everything he wasn't. Generous, kind, bringing joy to children. I wanted his last act to be a lie, just like his entire life had been a lie. The confession continued for an hour, Reed describing not just the murder, but the 20 years of pain that had preceded it, watching his mother's health decline, selling family possessions to pay for his father's appeals, visiting the prison where his father aged a decade in 3 years, holding his father's hand as he died, proclaiming an innocence no one believed. The parade had been the culmination of 2 decades of grief and rage, transformed into methodical planning and chemical precision. Read had known he would likely be caught. The chemical evidence was too specific, his access too documented, his motive too clear once investigators dug into the past. When Inspector Slack formally arrested him, Read seemed relieved. The weight of carrying both grief and guilt had finally become unbearable. As he was led away, he turned to Miss Marple with something almost like gratitude. "You understand, don't you, about patterns and patience and waiting for the right moment?" Miss Marple nodded sadly. She did understand, perhaps better than Read realized, how grief could transform into something poisonous, how the desire for justice could become indistinguishable from revenge. The workshop would be sealed, the evidence collected, the case prepared for trial. But the real evidence was in the destroyed lives Webb had left in his wake. Chapter 10. Red Velvet and White Snow. The trial of Thomas Read took place the following March, when the Christmas decorations had long been packed away and the village had tried to forget the horror of watching Santa Claus die during their beloved parade. Miss Marple attended every day, observing how Read sat quietly in the dock, showing no emotion as the prosecution laid out their case with damning precision. The defense tried to argue for diminished responsibility, citing the psychological trauma of his father's wrongful imprisonment and death, but Read himself refused to support this strategy. He had been entirely responsible, he insisted, entirely rational, entirely determined to see Marcus Webb pay for his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic team had found traces of digoxin throughout Read's workshop, DMSO residue on his workbench, and most damningly, security footage from a shop near the village hall that showed his distinctive figure entering the building on both nights in question. The prosecution presented the poison-treated Santa suit, now sealed in evidence bags, explaining how the red velvet had been transformed into a death trap that would activate with body heat and moisture. Dr. Haydock testified about the massive dose of digoxin found in Webb's system, enough to stop his heart within an hour of exposure. The other suspects were called as witnesses, each revealing their own motives for wanting Webb dead. Catherine Webb testified about the bigamy with controlled fury, explaining how she had discovered her entire marriage was invalid. Harold Price spoke quietly about his brother's suicide, reading portions of Jeremy's final note to the court. Dorothy Fletcher described the destruction of her family's business, the bankruptcy that had killed her father. Sarah Mills, youngest of them all, told of her destroyed engagement, her life derailed by Webb's manipulations. Each testimony painted Webb not as a victim, but as a serial destroyer of lives, who had finally met someone willing to destroy him in return. Read took the stand on the trial's final day, speaking clearly and without emotion about the murder. He had planned it for months after learning Webb would play Santa, researching methods that would ensure a public death. He had chosen poison over violence because he wanted Webb to die slowly, to have moments to realize what was happening, to understand that his vanity and need for public attention had finally killed him. The Santa costume had been perfect. Webb's ego had ensured he would wear it despite the warmth. His pride had kept him on the float even as he began feeling unwell. His need to be seen had placed him on display as the poison stopped his heart. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted the exceptional planning involved, the cold calculation required to poison a man in such an elaborate manner. But he also acknowledged the provocations Read had endured, the destruction of his family by Webb's criminal actions that had never been properly punished. The sentence was life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 15 years, longer than Read's father had been meant to serve, but shorter than the prosecution had requested. Read showed no reaction, having expected and perhaps wanted this outcome. Miss Marple reflected on the case during the train journey home from the trial. The Santa Claus parade, meant to open the Christmas season with joy and wonder, had instead become the setting for an execution decades in the making. The red velvet suit that should have delighted children had been turned into a sophisticated murder weapon, its festive appearance hiding lethal chemistry. The parade had continued the following Christmas with a new Santa, a retired teacher whose reputation was spotless, but attendance had been smaller, parents keeping children away from memories of Santa dying on his float. The costume itself had been destroyed after the trial, burned along with other evidence, its poison-soaked fibers reduced to ash. But Miss Marple knew the real poison hadn't been in the fabric. It had been in the hearts of those Webb had wronged, fermenting over years into something lethal. Thomas Reed would serve his time, his mother would die without him, his workshop would stand empty. The mechanical elves and painted angels would be distributed to other villages, their creator's skill separated from his crime. Connor here from Velvet Clues, signing off from this particularly dark Christmas tale. The murder of Marcus Webb reminds us that the most dangerous poisons aren't always chemical. Sometimes they're the grievances we nurture, the revenge we plan, the justice we take into our own hands when the law fails us. Thank you for joining me through this investigation. Sleep well, and remember that even in the season of joy and giving, human nature remains capable of both tremendous kindness and calculated cruelty. The red velvet suit is gone, but the questions it raises about justice, revenge, and the prices we pay for both will linger long after the last Christmas light is packed away.